Oh, hey, didn't see you there. While we've covered a game or two from the prestigious halls of things Ubisoft has screwed up, and we still have quite a few left, thanks to Big Boss Hector at the Flophouse VIP Patreon, we're setting our sights on a game that you might not expect. I hope you didn't get spoiled by the video title. Beyond Good and Evil was one of those great early video games that came out just as Ubisoft began to rise in prominence as a publisher. It was warmly reviewed by critics, had a cast of memorable characters, and still to this day has a passionate group of fans that have wanted to see the series continue since it started. That's because, as I'm sure most are aware, despite being a critical darling, BG&E famously failed to light up the sales charts, at all, and there's a bunch of reasons for that, of which we'll get into. The game itself, however, had more than its fair share of bumps along the way. But with that said, its long-delayed sequel is probably going, am I a joke to you? So take out your camera and get ready to snap some shots, because it's time to find out what happened with Beyond Good and Evil. And Beyond Good and Evil 2. It's the year of our Lord. It's 1999! And Rayman 2, The Great Escape, an incredible platformer that should be remade, has just been released for the Nintendo Ultra 64. It was developed by Ubi Pictures, their Montpellier studio, headed up by Michel Ancel, the creator of Rayman. While they were bug testing the limbless hero's foray into the complex polygonal world of 3 dimensions, they found an issue where if Man Ray boarded a specific flying vehicle, he could fly past the boundaries and collision of the level. This let him explore the unprogrammed vastness of complete nothingness. Instead of simply fixing the issue and just moving on, the bug stuck out in the minds of the team and Michel Ancel, and would be the impetus of their next project. They dreamed up a game where players could explore entire worlds, both on foot and in the skies, which would be an exciting change of pace from Rayman's straightforward platforming. With the 6th generation of consoles on the horizon, the team started designing big, ambitious style. Their game would let players hop into vehicles, take off from the planet's surface and into deep space, and then could land on a whole other world. Think No Man's Sky, but way, way earlier. Which, when you consider, No Man's Sky, probably meant it wasn't a technically sound idea. Once the team received the hard specs for the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, they realized they needed to scale back, and scale back they did. It then morphed into much more of a traditional action-adventure, but still keeping some elements of freedom from their initial design. The game was dubbed Project BG&E, and it would focus on a young girl named Sally, her brother Toil, and their partner Paige, who may or may not have been an anthropomorphic pigman just yet. All of this obviously changed. Sally turned into Jade, and Paige became Jade's adoptive uncle. That open-world design was relegated to the singular world of Hillis, which could be explored at any time and was fairly big from 6th generation standards. The look of the game was far different than what we're familiar with today, featuring a much more evocative art style similar to stuff like Eco. Jade herself was also quite different, being more of a teenager in this early iteration, with her combat capabilities being pretty minimal. She had a simple melee attack, but mostly relied on puzzle solving and avoiding her enemies instead. Even though the team had greatly pared down their original vision, the game was still very akin to Zelda's open nature, letting players tackle it at their own pace. However, Michel Ancel also wanted a Hollywood-esque storyline, with cutscenes told in a linear fashion, which are 2 things that aren't the easiest to mix. This inevitably led to a bit of conflict, to maintain the pacing and story structure of a movie, but to allow gamers to explore a living, breathing world at the same time. The game made its first public showing at E3 2002, and unsurprisingly, the game got a negative reaction. Wait, what? Yeah, reportedly this version of Beyond Good and Evil was met with apathy from a lot of people who played it at the Ubisoft booth, which was probably more of a sign of the times than anything else. The game lacked a certain appeal when the industry was turning towards edgier stuff. After that showing, the team, under Michel Ancel's direction, dramatically started to redesign a lot of the game. The art style was tweaked, combat and fighting were expanded, and the plot became more generalized, focusing on an invading alien race subjugating Hillis. Jade was changed to be more of an action heroine, a bit older and more confident. However, the biggest change came not from the feedback they received at E3, but from something else entirely. In March of 2003, another game that focused on the exploration of a watery world was released, and on one of the platforms Beyond Good and Evil was targeting, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Now, while being a very good Zelda title overall, it was not without its critics, and Michel Ancel was one of them. He was very critical of the exploration of the Great Sea, feeling that the sailing was often boring and that the player was forced to do too much of it. This caused him to want to scale back the open world nature of Beyond Good and Evil even further, which is why much of the last half of the game is a series of linear dungeon crawls and stealth sequences. Many on the dev team felt demoralized after this change, as their original plan of embracing the thrill of exploration and freedom had now taken such a back seat it was being dragged behind the hovercraft. Before we move on, there was one other thing to consider. Beyond Good and Evil wasn't even the only game they were making. The studio had split itself into two groups, with about 30 people working on Beyond, while the other half produced Rayman 3 Hoodlum Havoc. While this didn't have any direct, catastrophic consequences on either project, it's easy to imagine that having everyone focus on just one game might have been better than splitting resources between the two. As they were reaching the end of development, the game barely resembled what it had started out as, but it certainly was more marketable, especially with its increased focus on combat and Jade being positioned as an alternative to Lara Croft. Its title, Beyond Good and Evil, sharing the exact same name as Nietzsche's famous novel, was certainly a mouthful and not the most marketable name. It promised a heavier concept, perhaps with the player being thrust into a narrative that had many moral shades of gray, but that's not really what the game was about. It was a colorful, straightforward action-adventure in the vein of Star Wars, with a hearty helping of Bucky O'Hare, of course.
Bucky! Captain Bucky O'Hare! Mutants and aliens and toads beware!
There was a very clear villain, evil green aliens that kidnap people for evil reasons. This then left Ubisoft marketing in a bit of a quandary. Who exactly was this game for, and how do they advertise it? Turns out the answer was to not advertise it at all.
I arranged a focus group to see if my marketing approach would work with actual children. When I show this to you, what do you think? Do you want it?
Nope. Nah.
Ubi had their hands full with other big titles in 2003, including PC, PS2, and GameCube versions of their smash hit Splinter Cell. But the decision that probably hurt Beyond Good and Evil the most was the fact that it competed with Ubisoft's own Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, as all versions were being released within 2 weeks of each other. Persia, being a familiar name, performed much better on the charts, as it was easier to market and garnered even higher reviews. Coupled with the fact that both games were roughly the same in genre, being third-person action adventures, means they wound up eating into each other's sales. Ubi's executive director of North American operations cites the failure of marketing Beyond Good and Evil to be the biggest regret of his career. While I can't find hard sales numbers, it's been thrown around that despite the original release being on 4 total platforms, the game sold less than 500,000 copies. Fortunately though, as stated earlier, the game's many positives nevertheless shine through. Its unique world, well-voiced characters, graphics, and cinematic flair were all of particular note. It's actually in the game's latter half where the player is railroaded into dungeons with stealth sequences that most took issue with. So while these changes that Michel Ancel enforced didn't gravely affect the game's overall quality, it does make you think if it might have been better off if they had stuck with their original vision. In the subsequent years, Beyond Good and Evil took on this almost legendary status, this unsung hidden gem that wasn't appreciated in its own time. What it did do, however, was impress Peter Jackson, the world-famous film director, best known for his impactful, resonating, well-loved blockbuster Dead Alive.
I kick ass for the Lord!
Beyond Good and Evil's impact on Jackson led to a deal being inked for Ubisoft Pictures, now renamed Ubisoft Montpellier, to adapt 2005's King Kong to the medium of interactive entertainment. It would go on to be one of the best movie-to-game adaptations of all time. If you want to see me revisit that classic, you can do so in this video here. So while the world of Hillis wasn't the money spinner Ubisoft wanted, it did net them lucrative deals indirectly. And then for a long time, nothing happened. Sorta. In 2008, Ubisoft publicly said that Beyond Good and Evil 2 was in development, and presented this now famous trailer that didn't really show anything. The game wasn't far into development when it was announced, but it made some progress by 2009 before it was put on hold. These screenshots show off a build Ancel reportedly showed behind closed doors, having a distinct, gritty 7th gen look to it. While the reasons for its temporary cancellation are unknown, it seems other projects simply took priority at Ubisoft Montpellier. The team was split once again, with one team working on Rayman Origins while the other worked on Tintin, no doubt spurred by Ubi's relationship with Peter Jackson. Once those were released in 2011 and Origins being a big hit, Michel Ancel and his team started on Rayman Legends, which further delayed Jade's big return. 2011 was also notable for one other reason, as fans were tossed an all-too-rare bone with Beyond Good and Evil HD, which released on the PS3 and the Xbox 360. While it didn't do anything that drastically improved the game, it at least updated it with some graphical enhancements. Now, according to some Ubi representatives, this HD remaster did perform well, but since it was exclusively a digital title, its actual sales numbers were never disclosed. Also, a bit weird that the game, despite only coming out a year before the Wii U, never saw a port to that system. Then for a long time, nothing happened. Again. Unfortunately, as those years ticked away with no updates, Beyond Good and Evil had accrued something of a curse within Ubi's offices. Its financial failure actually started influencing what projects Ubisoft would and would not greenlight. In fact, 2014's Child of Light very nearly didn't happen due to this reason. The turn-based RPG's creative director explains, "If the game, Child of Light, is a missed opportunity, then it's going to be a missed opportunity for years. Even when I pitched Child of Light, they mentioned Beyond Good and Evil. They said Beyond Good and Evil was not a success, and we made that mistake once." And it's like, yeah, but that was 10 years ago. If somebody tries something and fails, there are going to be repercussions for other people. For me, it would be a shame if that happens. I don't think people are malevolent or evil about that, it's just if it fails, they're going to be careful greenlighting other similar projects. It took until 2016 for rumors of a Beyond Good and Evil 2 to start surfacing once again, but this time with a very inaccurate spin to it. It was thrown around that Nintendo had financed the sequel exclusively for, as it was known back then, the NX. While the Beyond Good and Evil 2 part existing was true, the rest wasn't. At E3 2017, which let me remind you was 4 years ago, Beyond Good and Evil 2 was officially unveiled. Again. And it was not what fans expected. Instead of an action-adventure focusing on Jade, it was, well, I'm not sure what it was. It was impressive, it seemed to provide a lot of freedom, and judging by the visuals, was leaning towards the more open exploration galaxy thing that the original team had first dreamed up. And that's all we really know. It's unclear if the game is going to be an MMO or a single-player thing, live service, and if it was any of those things, that might have completely changed, as Ubisoft has remained tight-lipped ever since. Now, this could be a good or bad thing. Most people believe due to the timing of its unveiling and the obvious scope they were aiming for means that the PS4 and Xbox One have since been scrapped as platforms, and the game has been redesigned with next-gen exclusively in mind. But its troubles don't stop there. Last year, when Ubisoft came under fire for its toxic and abusive workplaces, Michel Ancel was also placed under investigation, but coincidentally suddenly quit game development altogether, while he was in the middle of 2 projects. These were, of course, Beyond Good and Evil 2 and Wild. Remember this thing? Yeah, that's still in development by a completely separate, non-Ubisoft-owned studio that he himself had set up back in 2014. Ancel stated that while he was pursuing other outside interests, that both projects were in good hands, but that's it. We've gotten no further updates regarding either since. There were allegations cited by anonymous employees that Ancel would regularly verbally abuse and dismiss his staff and their ideas in front of others, allegations he has since denied. Right now, it's unknown if the investigation will be pursued any further, as he is no longer employed by Ubisoft at all. As for Beyond Good and Evil 2, well, it's a very real possibility that it's going to be unveiled for, the 3rd time now? And if and when it does, it might look really cool, and it might be the more focused single-player adventure that most fans want to see. Or it might have a map that looks like this. Or it could very well be cancelled altogether. This entire franchise has had such a stop-go development cycle that it's really hard to assume anything at this point, so I guess it's strangely appropriate for the wild, unpredictable world of Hillis. If you know of any other open-world atrocities, believe me, I know of a few, then jot down some in the comments below. And if you want to directly support the channel, head on over to pixelempire.com/McMuscles to check out my new line of What Happened merch, or head on over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss and nominate what you want to see in a future episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.